the hum of the airplane engines mixed with the muffled conversations and sounds of seat belts clicking into place. Passengers in the first-class cabin adjusted their seats, settling in for the long flight ahead. The overhead bins were neatly packed, the attendants efficiently moving down the aisles, preparing for takeoff. Among the passengers sat Captain James Carter, a tall and well-built man with a calm, composed demeanor. His uniform, neatly pressed, displayed several ribbons and medals, silent testaments to the years of service he had dedicated to his country. His mind was a mixture of relief and exhaustion, the weight of his deployment finally lifting as he neared the end of his journey home. As the plane started its ascent, he opened the book in his hands, his eyes scanning the pages as the seatbelt sign flickered off. Sitting beside him was Karen Whitfield, a woman in her mid-40s with perfectly styled hair, a designer handbag, and a sharp, disapproving look. Her eyes scanned the cabin and settled on James, her expression twisting into a faint sneer. She immediately began complaining about the seating arrangements, her voice growing louder with each word. "Can't believe they'd seat someone like you next to me," she muttered under her breath, but loud enough for James to hear. "This isn't a budget flight." James didn't respond. He didn't need to. His focus remained on his book as he gently adjusted in his seat, trying to block out her growing complaints. As the plane leveled out, Karen's eyes fell on James's military uniform, the creases in his jacket sharply outlining his service stripes. Her eyes narrowed, her lips curled slightly in disdain as she muttered, "Why do they let just anyone fly in first class these days?" James's grip tightened slightly on his book, but he chose not to engage, knowing any reaction would feed into her ignorance. He let the words slide off him, his face calm and stoic. He had learned long ago not to rise to the bait of small-mindedness. Karen, however, couldn't resist pressing the issue further. She shifted in her seat, casting an exaggerated glance at the uniformed man next to her. "Aren't you a little out of place up here?" she added, louder this time. "First class is for people who can actually afford it, not, well, whatever you are." James remained unfazed, his gaze still fixed on the pages of his book. It wasn't the first time he had encountered such prejudice, nor would it be the last. The tension in the air was palpable as the flight continued its smooth journey, the steady hum of the engines providing an eerie contrast to the escalating hostility in the cabin. Karen's fidgeting grew more pronounced, her discontent increasingly obvious to those around her. She shifted in her seat, crossing and uncrossing her legs as if she could physically distance herself from James, though the space between them remained the same. After several more muttered complaints about the unacceptable seating arrangement, Karen turned directly to James. Her eyes narrowed, and her voice, laced with disdain, broke through the calm atmosphere of the cabin. "You know," she said sharply, "people like you should know their place." The words were meant to cut deep, and they did, though James showed no sign of being affected. The passengers around them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances at the tension that was beginning to build. A few dared to look over the top of their seats, their attention caught by the rising conflict. The silence in the cabin thickened, waiting for someone, anyone, to intervene. James, maintaining the same unflappable composure he had learned in both the military and life, closed his book gently. With a calm yet firm voice, he addressed Karen directly. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" The question, simple yet pointed, struck a nerve. Karen's face flushed red with frustration, and her nostrils flared as she prepared to escalate. "Yes, there's a problem," she snapped. I don't feel comfortable sitting next to someone like you." Her words, dripping with prejudice, were loud enough for several surrounding passengers to hear. A murmur spread through the cabin, the atmosphere now charged with discomfort. Before the situation could spiral further, a flight attendant, a young woman with an air of professionalism, arrived at the scene. She had overheard the exchange and immediately moved in to de-escalate. Her presence was like a breath of fresh air, though it did little to calm Karen, whose anger was now bubbling to the surface. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said, addressing Karen with polite firmness, "I'm sorry to hear that you're upset, but there is no reason to feel unsafe. This is a peaceful environment, and we ask that all passengers treat one another with respect." Karen, however, was having none of it. "Respect?" she scoffed. "I don't feel safe sitting next to someone like him." Her finger jutted out accusingly at James as though he were the source of all her discomfort. The flight attendant's calm demeanor did not falter. "There's no reason to feel unsafe, ma'am. This is an airplane, and we ensure the safety of every passenger. We ask that you please remain seated and allow us to continue with the flight." The flight attendant's eyes subtly indicated to Karen that it was time to end the confrontation. James, although still calm, could feel the eyes of the passengers on him now. He did not want the situation to escalate any further. His experience in handling adversity had taught him that some battles were better fought with dignity than with words. James Carter's journey had not been easy, but it had shaped him into the man he had become. Resilient, determined, and unyielding in his commitment to serving both his country and his community. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, James was no stranger to hardship. The streets around his home in the inner city were tough, with constant challenges and a feeling that hope was often in short supply. But for James, there was always one beacon of light: his mother, who tirelessly instilled in him a sense of self-worth, no matter what the world threw at him. From a young age, James excelled academically. He was one of those kids who always seemed to have his nose in a book, not just because he loved learning, but because he knew education was his way out. His mother had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, often tired and worn from the long hours, but she never complained. Instead, she would sit at the kitchen table late at night, reading through her own books while James did his homework. She would remind him, "You're going to do great things, son, but only if you believe in yourself." By the time James was a teenager, he knew that his path would lead him to serve in the military. He'd always admired those who wore the uniform, men and women who had made sacrifices he couldn't fully understand but deeply respected. With his mind sharp and his body strong, James joined the military straight out of high school. It wasn't just about escaping his environment. It was about something deeper. He wanted to fight for his country and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The military quickly took notice of his intelligence and leadership skills. Within months, he had earned respect from his peers and superiors alike. He was promoted rapidly, showing not just the ability to lead, but a deep understanding of military strategy and the ability to think on his feet under pressure. However, that respect didn't come easily. James was often one of the few black soldiers in a unit, and while he earned his place through his accomplishments, he was never completely free from the biases of others. He had faced quiet prejudice, subtle insults, and the sting of being overlooked in favor of others simply because of his skin color. Despite this, James never let it deter him. He was determined to prove his worth, not just to others, but to himself. During his service, James earned multiple commendations for his bravery and leadership. He participated in high-stakes missions, leading his fellow soldiers through difficult terrains, and even being part of a team that successfully diffused a critical situation in a foreign country. But for James, it was the respect of his fellow soldiers, rather than the medals, that mattered the most. He knew that respect couldn't be earned through simple gestures or superficial acts. It had to be earned through every decision he made, every mission he led, and every life he protected. However, despite all the praise he received, James couldn't help but notice the quiet discrimination that lingered, both from within the ranks and from the outside world. It was subtle, but pervasive, a harsh look here, an offhand remark there. He would never forget the day he had been asked to do a task that no one else wanted, simply because of the color of his skin. That day, though frustrating, reaffirmed his resolve. James had learned early in life that the world wouldn't always be fair, but he would always strive to be the best version of himself. 2 years ago, when James received word that he had been deployed on a mission that would take him far from home, he didn't hesitate. He knew it was his duty, and he accepted it with quiet pride. But as the months wore on, the strain of being away from his family started to take its toll. James missed his wife, his young daughter, and even the simple things about home. The sound of his daughter's laughter, his wife's warm embrace, and the comfort of knowing that he was there to protect them. After 2 years of service, it was time for James to return home. His deployment was finally over, and he had a special surprise in store for his family. He had saved up enough money from his service to purchase a small gift for his daughter, a beautiful bracelet with her birthstone. He imagined the look of joy on her face when he handed it to her, his heart swelling with pride at the thought of finally being reunited with his loved ones. The flight home was long, but for the first time in a while, James felt at peace. He looked out the window, lost in thoughts of his daughter's smile, of how he would hold her again, and how they would be a family again. Little did he know, the journey ahead would hold a different kind of challenge, one that would test his strength, his patience, and his ability to stand tall in the face of prejudice. As the plane continued its journey, James reflected on the path that had brought him here. From his childhood in the tough neighborhoods to his service in the military, every step had been marked by resilience. But now, as he prepared to go home to his family, he realized that he had already won the battle that mattered most, the battle for his family's love, safety, and future. The tension in the cabin was palpable as Karen's insults grew more pointed. Her voice, once a mere murmur of discontent, escalated into a clear accusation. "You're a fraud," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "I bet you're just some guy who bought a uniform to sit in first class. You don't belong here. This is a seat for real people, not people like you." Passengers around them began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some had already turned their heads in disbelief, while others whispered among themselves, unsure whether they should step in. One elderly woman, seated across the aisle from James, clenched her hands in her lap, her lips pressed into a tight line. Another man, who had overheard the exchange, shot a disapproving glance at Karen before turning his attention back to his magazine. It was as if the entire plane had briefly paused, holding its collective breath. But James remained composed. His hands still rested on the armrests, his posture straight and proud, though his gaze never wavered from Karen's. He wasn't rattled, wasn't angry. In fact, his voice was calm and steady as he finally responded. "Ma'am," James began, his words carrying the weight of years of service, I've spent my life serving people like you, so you can have the freedom to say what you just said. I'm not asking for your respect, but I will tell you this: disrespect toward anyone, especially when they've done nothing to deserve it, speaks volumes about you, not me." His words hung in the air for a moment, and for the first time, Karen faltered. She opened her mouth to retort, but closed it again, clearly not prepared for such a measured response. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, and James could feel the tide of support slowly shifting. Even the flight attendants, who'd been busy preparing the cabin for landing, began to notice the scene. "Excuse me, ma'am," one of the attendants said, stepping forward. The flight attendant was a woman in her mid-30s, with a no-nonsense attitude. "I'll have to ask you to move to the back of the plane. We don't tolerate disrespect toward our passengers regardless of who they are." Karen's face flushed bright red, her anger now spilling over. "I refuse to sit next to him. You can't make me do this. I'm not going anywhere," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch as she gestured toward James. The flight attendant remained firm. "I'm sorry, but you're creating an uncomfortable situation for everyone around you. You'll have to move, or we'll have to get the captain involved. Your choice." Karen's face twisted with outrage. She shot one final venomous glare at James before grabbing her bag and stomping down the aisle. As she passed by, the passengers closest to her looked away, some choosing to ignore her, while others exchanged looks of silent approval. No one was going to argue with the flight attendant's decision. Once Karen was moved to the back of the plane, the cabin seemed to exhale collectively. The tension in the air dissipated, replaced by a quiet sense of solidarity. James sat back, his eyes briefly scanning the passengers around him. A few people gave him small nods of acknowledgement, but he remained silent, focusing on the task at hand. He wasn't here for recognition. He was here to get home, to his family, to his life. But in that moment, a small, unspoken victory had been won. The flight attendant, now back at her station, threw James a small, approving smile. "Thank you for your patience, sir," she said quietly, her tone warmer now that the conflict had been resolved. James simply nodded, grateful for the support, but not seeking further praise. He gazed out of the window once more, his thoughts turning inward. The moment had passed, but the weight of Karen's words lingered in his mind. It wasn't the first time he had encountered prejudice, but it was a stark reminder of the battle many still faced every day. It didn't matter if you wore a uniform or had a title. For some, there was always an assumption based on your appearance. But what mattered to James was not what others thought of him. It was what he knew to be true. As the plane began its descent, James reflected on the journey ahead, both in the air and in his life. He was getting closer to home, closer to his daughter's embrace. The world could be full of obstacles, but the resilience to rise above them, that, to him, was the true measure of a person. And despite everything, he knew that this was only the beginning of his journey. As the flight continued, the tension began to subside. However, the damage had already been done. Several passengers who had witnessed the altercation discreetly pulled out their phones and began recording the incident. Karen's increasingly hostile behavior, her insults, and the confrontation with the flight attendant were all captured on camera. One of the passengers, a younger man seated a few rows back, managed to upload the video to social media using the plane's Wi-Fi connection before they began their descent. As the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign was turned off, the social media post quickly spread across various platforms, accumulating thousands of views in just a few minutes. Comments poured in, many expressing outrage at Karen's behavior, while others praised James for his calm and dignified response to the unjust treatment. The hashtag number Respect the Uniform began trending, along with a growing collection of comments calling for accountability. By the time the plane landed, Karen had already started receiving notifications on her phone. At first, they were just a few messages, friends and family members reaching out to see if she had landed safely. But as she scrolled through her notifications, her eyes widened in shock. She saw post after post, news outlets covering the incident and messages from strangers expressing their disgust at her actions. Panic set in as Karen realized that the entire situation was now public. Her identity had been revealed, and the video of her humiliating James had gone viral. She had no idea how far the video had spread or how many people were now commenting on her behavior. Her face flushed with embarrassment, and a sinking feeling took hold in her stomach as she understood the gravity of what she had done. As she hurried off the plane, Karen's phone buzzed incessantly with calls. A few from her friends, but many more from business associates and strangers. Her voicemail was filled with messages asking her to explain herself, or worse, condemning her for what she had said. The realization hit her hard. Her actions, now broadcasted to the world, would have lasting consequences. It was no longer just a private encounter. It was a public spectacle, and she had no way to escape from the storm she had created. As James walked off the plane, the weariness of the long flight began to fade, replaced by the warmth and joy of what awaited him. As he entered the terminal, his eyes immediately found his wife, Lisa, and their young daughter, Mia, standing by the arrival's gate. His heart swelled as he saw the big "Welcome Home, Daddy" sign they were holding, a sign of love and excitement for his return after 2 long years overseas. Mia jumped up and down, her face beaming with excitement, while Lisa smiled warmly, holding their daughter's hand tightly. James approached them with a big smile of his own, his heart full of gratitude as he moved toward the 2 people who meant the world to him. As he neared them, Mia ran into his arms, wrapping her tiny arms around his neck. "Daddy, you're home!" she squealed, her voice full of pure joy. James scooped her up into his arms, his eyes moistening as he kissed the top of her head. Lisa stepped forward, tears in her eyes as she embraced him tightly. "Welcome home, James," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The reunion, so tender and emotional, seemed to erase the tension and fatigue of the past months. It was moments like these, the pure love of family, that made all the hardships of his service worthwhile. While James and his family shared this beautiful moment, something unexpected happened. A group of passengers from his flight, who had seen the entire confrontation unfold, approached him. One of them, a man in his 40s, stepped forward hesitantly. "Excuse me, sir," he began, looking a little embarrassed. "I just wanted to apologize for the behavior of the woman next to you during the flight. It was completely disrespectful. You handled it with such dignity, and I just wanted to thank you for your service." The man's words were sincere, but James merely smiled, shaking his head. "Thank you, but no apology is needed," he said with quiet grace. "I just do my job." His words were calm, as if he were trying to ease the discomfort the passengers felt. To James, this was all part of his life's work, serving his country and, whenever possible, showing strength and integrity in the face of adversity. A woman who had been seated in the row behind Karen approached next. Her expression was apologetic, though she still seemed uncertain. "I just wanted to say how sorry I am for what you went through," she said. That woman was absolutely out of line. "We all noticed how well you handled the situation, and we're grateful for your service." She extended her hand, and James, though a little surprised by her sincerity, shook it with a nod. James's humility and composure in the face of adversity left an indelible mark on the passengers. While they had witnessed firsthand how Karen had treated him, they now saw him for who he truly was: a brave man, a soldier, a father, and a husband, whose service was deserving of nothing but respect. Lisa and Mia watched the brief exchange with pride. They knew the kind of man James was, and though they could see the ripple effect his actions had on the people around him, they also saw the modesty with which he accepted their praise. For James, doing the right thing and maintaining his integrity was just part of who he was. It wasn't something that warranted applause or recognition. Still, Lisa could tell how much this moment meant to him. As the crowd around them thinned out, James held Mia's hand while Lisa walked beside him, her eyes never leaving his. They made their way out of the airport, their hearts light and full of hope for the future. James had returned home not just as a soldier, but as a man who had faced injustice with dignity, and in doing so had inspired those around him to be better. He was home. The fallout for Karen was swift and unforgiving. The viral video of her behavior on the plane spread like wildfire across social media, quickly making headlines. News outlets were quick to highlight her racist and disrespectful treatment of James, and the backlash was overwhelming. Within hours, Karen's employer, a high-end consulting firm, issued a statement condemning her actions and announcing her termination. She had violated their company's strict code of conduct, and they could no longer justify keeping her on staff. Her professional reputation crumbled as friends, colleagues, and family members distanced themselves from her. Many expressed their disgust over her actions, with some even publicly distancing themselves from her on social media. Karen found herself isolated, her phone filled with angry messages and notifications. Her social media was flooded with comments from people calling her out, including veterans and their families who condemned her treatment of James, a man who had risked his life for the country. Sitting in her upscale apartment, Karen scrolled through the overwhelming amount of backlash, her once comfortable life now overshadowed by the storm she had created. The messages were relentless, people describing how disgusted they were by her behavior, calling her out for her ignorance and prejudice. As she read through the messages from veterans who shared stories of their own struggles and sacrifice, Karen couldn't ignore the profound sense of guilt that weighed on her. She had underestimated James and misjudged his character, and now her actions had irrevocably changed her life. For the first time, Karen found herself questioning the person she had become, and the isolation she now faced forced her to confront the consequences of her own prejudice. As James steps outside the airport, a local news crew approaches him, eager to get his thoughts on the viral incident. They ask how he feels about the attention surrounding his confrontation with Karen. James smiles softly and responds with quiet strength, "We all have the right to be treated with dignity, no matter who we are. Kindness and respect will always outweigh hate. What happened on that plane wasn't about me. It was about something much larger, standing up for what's right." His words resonate, offering a glimpse into the character of a man who has seen the worst and yet continues to uphold his values. The camera fades as James walks away, cradling his young daughter in his arms. They head towards the car, and as he glances at her smiling face, the weight of his past service and sacrifices seems lighter. In that moment, James is not just a soldier, but a father, walking toward the peace he has fought so hard to protect. The scene ends with a sense of calm as James and his family head home, leaving behind a legacy of strength, dignity, and unshakable respect for others.